Almost 900 years ago, an unknown writer recorded a small peninsula at the southernmost edge of what is now Finland in the so-called Danish Itinerary. The itinerary describes a route that follows the eastern coast of Sweden, after which it turns eastward through the archipelago toward the southern coast of Finland. Several harbor sites from the archipelago and northern coast of the Gulf of Finland are mentioned along the route. One of them is Hanko. The peninsula had already long served as an important stopping point for sailing ships, which sometimes had to wait for more favorable winds for weeks at a time. The first harbor of Cape Hanko was located on the northern shore of the peninsula in what is now known as Kappeli-Satama Bay. On the hill called Kasperberget, just north of the bay, the village pilots kept signal fires burning to guide seafarers. So today I'm driving about 2 hours way down to the southernmost point in Finland and to check out a place that has stood on the crossroads of history for, centuries, and where Finland quite literally comes to an end. And through the centuries, this narrow strip of land has witnessed far more than passing ships. It has stood under the rules of empires, seen the ambitions of powerful men, endured war, been the last sight of home for many before setting out in the search of a new life across the ocean, and remained a gateway between East and West. And it still serves the same purpose it did hundreds of years ago, a harbor at the southernmost edge of Finland. Long before anyone charted these waters, this land lay buried beneath ice. At the height of the last ice age, a massive continental glacier covered all of Finland under layers of ice more than 2 kilometers thick. Around 11,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. The great ice sheet started to retreat northward, and as the weight of the ice lifted, the land itself began to rise. Where Hanko now reaches into the Baltic Sea, there was once only open water and a shifting shoreline. But as the ice withdrew and new land emerged, people followed. Southwestern Finland, with its rich archipelago and sheltered waters, gradually became especially attractive. The sea provided fish and transport routes. Forests offered game. The coastline that medieval sailors would later navigate was shaped by a maze of rocky islands and cold, brackish waters. As the land steadily rose from the sea, new shores and meadows emerged. Over time, small communities took root along these waterways, linked by boats and bound to the rhythms of the Baltic. I can clearly see why people came here in the first place. The vast ocean at your disposal, the clear shoreline, the smaller islands, and, well, it's very beautiful as well. The first surviving literacy source where Hanko is mentioned is an early medieval description of a sea route, the itinerary of Danish King Valdemar II Sail. The source has been dated to the late 13th or early 14th century, but the route is described to have an older origin. It begins from the border area between medieval Denmark and Sweden, or from present-day provinces of Scania and Blekinge. The itinerary describes a route that follows the Swedish east coast, where after it turns eastward through the archipelago and southern coast of Finland and finally reaches Tallinn. In this early medieval source, Hanko is recorded under 2 different names, the Swedish Hangethe and the Finnish Kumimpe. Scholars have suggested that the document may have been written in 1241 in the chancery of the Bishop of Tallinn, Torkel, or possibly by the Franciscan order in the late 13th century. What is certain, however, is that the sea route it describes was already in use well before then, at the latest by 1219 to 1220, when the Danes conquered northern Estonia and converted its inhabitants to Christianity. The places mentioned in this medieval itinerary were islands or headlands with established settlements even at that time. After this account, the next surviving descriptions of Finland's coastal sailing routes do not appear until the mid-1500s, when present-day Finland was still part of the Swedish realm. In the mid-13th century, the Swedes launched what is known as the Second Crusade against the Tavastians. In its aftermath, Swedish colonization of Uusimaa brought settlers to Hanko as well. By the 15th century, the tip of Tulliniemi had begun to serve as a harbor. Just offshore lies Hauensuoli, a narrow, winding strait between the islets of Gamla-Tullen and Kobben. This sheltered passage would become one of the most storied maritime landmarks in the Baltic. When the Bishop of Uppsala, Olaus Magnus, wrote his monumental history of Nordic peoples in the Vatican in 1555, he described the Hanko Peninsula as the finest harbor in the northern hemisphere. He also mentioned Hauensuoli, whose rocky cliffs were covered with carved names and coats of arms left by passing seafarers. Statesmen and commanders of the Swedish realm stopped at Hauensuoli on their campaigns to Russia, the Baltic lands, Poland, and Germany. During the wars of expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries, Sweden rose to dominance over the Baltic Sea, and Hauensuoli became a silent witness to that ascent. Today, around 640 carvings have been recorded in the rocks of Hauensuoli, including 130 noble coats of arms. Among them are the imposing heraldic emblems of Klaus Fleming and Erik Axelsson Oxenstierna. Numerous members of the Horn family, along with many other nobles from Finland, Sweden, the Baltic region, and Germany, also left their marks on these stark coastal cliffs. Yet, Hauensuoli was not only a waypoint of empires. As Sweden strengthened its administration in Finland, the crown began systematically mapping villages and hamlets from the 1640s onward. In 1647, the land surveyor Hans Hansson drew a map of Hanko where 5 farmsteads were marked. 3 was clustered around what is today known as Gunnarsengen, while 2 lay several hundred meters further to the north. At first glance, these scattered farmsteads may seem insignificant, small lives on the edge of the sea, but they existed within something far greater. By the 17th century, Sweden had risen to the status of a great European power, at the expense of Denmark, Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the German states. It controlled vast territories, but above all, it dominated the Baltic Sea, its shipping lanes, and its trade. But in 1700s, the power balance changed. The outbreak of the Great Northern War pitted Sweden against a powerful coalition of Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Saxony, Poland. In 1714, the war reached the waters of Hanko. That summer, the Swedish and Russian fleets confronted one another in the Baltic, and Tsar Peter the Great himself was present at the Hanko Peninsula. In calm weather, Russia's galley fleet managed to row around the tip of Tulliniemi, slipping past Sweden's heavy ships of the line, which lay immobilized in the still air. North of the peninsula, a smaller Swedish naval detachment awaited, and on July 27, 1714, Peter's forces defeated it in the Battle of Kangut, known in the Finnish history as the Battle of Riilahti. According to legend, the bay ran red with the blood of the fallen. In the aftermath began the period known in Finland as the Great Wrath, the harsh years of Russian occupation. Russian troops burned the villages of the peninsula, and the customs post at Hauensuoli was left deserted. Only after the Treaty of Neustadt in 1721, when, after 2 decades of devastating conflict, Sweden was finally defeated and its era as the undisputed master of the Baltic came to an end, did the inhabitants gradually begin returning to their homes. Yet the 18th century brought little lasting peace. Mid-century came the Lesser Wrath, during renewed conflict and during Gustav III's Russian War in 1788. Russian forces once again burned the villages of the peninsula. Toward the end of the century, Sweden began fortifying Hanko. Between what are now western and eastern harbors, a small urban settlement emerged, about 40 houses in all. Tulliniemi too was fortified. The aim was clear: to prevent an enemy fleet from passing Hanko into the Gulf of Bothnia and threatening even Stockholm, a scenario that had already become reality during Peter the Great's campaign in 1714. But the fortifications were never fully completed. In the Finnish War, Russia ultimately conquered Finland, bringing more than 6 centuries of Swedish rule to an end in 1809. And when Finland became a Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire, the Hanko Peninsula entered an entirely new chapter in its story.
And when you stand here and look out over the water, you can begin to understand why. This long, narrow finger of land stretches far into the Baltic Sea. And because of that, ships were often able to reach these shores even in the middle of winter, at a time when ice had sealed off most of other Finnish ports.
While much of the country lay frozen and cut off from the outside world, Hanko remained open. Recognizing its strategic importance, a major port was constructed on the peninsula between 1871 and 1873, along with a railway connection to Hyvinkää. The goal was to secure a reliable winter transport route to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital. In 1874, Tsar Alexander II officially founded the town of Hanko. Just a few years later, in 1879, a spa was established in the town. By the early 20th century, Hanko had transformed into a lively seaside resort. Elegant villas and boarding houses rose along the shoreline, welcoming wealthy Russian families who arrived by train and steamship to spend their summers by the sea. A grand restaurant building, the Hangö Casino, was constructed on the sandy shores of Blagen, becoming a symbol of the town's fashionable character. At the same time, industry expanded steadily from the 1880s onward, and Hanko grew into both a leisure destination and an important industrial hub. But Hanko was not only a place of arrival. For hundreds of thousands, it became a place of departure.
Right behind me was the building of Suomen Höyrylaiva-yhtiö, which was responsible for organizing emigrant journeys from Hanko. The company decided to build an emigrant hotel on Boulevardi in connection with its office. The building has 2 floors. The lower floor was made of brick and the upper floor of wood,
and the hotel was designed to accommodate about 300 people. A small number considering how many immigrants passed through the port of Hanko at that time. Between 1880 and 1930, nearly 400,000 Finns left their homeland in search of a better life abroad. Of these immigrants, around 250,000 passed through the port of Hanko. The town became, in many ways, the capital of Finnish emigration. The largest waves were bound for the United States, Canada, and Australia. Hanko's role became especially significant in the late 1870s when regular winter steamship connections were opened to Stockholm. From there, the route continued via Copenhagen to England. The ships carried Finnish export goods, most notably butter, and human hopes in equal measure. Some of the cargo remained in Denmark. The emigrants did not. They continued on to England and boarded transatlantic liners bound for the New World. For many, Hanko was a brief but intense threshold between two lives. They arrived a day or two before departure, lodging in crowded boarding houses and preparing for the journey ahead. At the emigrant office, papers were inspected and stamped. Fees were paid. Medical examinations were conducted. Bureaucracy stood side by side with anticipation and uncertainty. And when the waiting stretched longer than expected, life found its own rhythm. On the smooth seaside rocks of Puistovuoret, music would sometimes begin to play, and people danced, perhaps to ease their nerves, perhaps to hold on to one last moment of familiarity before stepping into the unknown. In those years, the harbor was more than a center of trade and industry. It was a place where dreams, goods, and entire lives passed through. It was precisely this strategic and logistical importance that would once again place Hanko at the center of great power tensions when Europe descended into war. During the First World War, the town found itself drawn into conflict. In August 1914, fearing a German advance, Russian forces destroyed parts of the port facilities and the railway workshop. Further devastation was narrowly avoided when the local customs director, Captain Wikström, intervened and managed to halt the sabotage. Between 1914 and 1918, Hanko served solely as a military port. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, Hanko's fate took a dramatic turn. Under the peace terms, Finland was forced to lease the 115 square kilometer area to the Soviet Union. The area included the town of Hanko, the entire peninsula, surrounding waters, and nearly 400 islands. The evacuation order allowed just 10 days, and around 8,000 residents were compelled to leave their homes. On March 22, 1940, Hanko became a Soviet military base. For the Soviet Union, the peninsula was immense strategic value. Control of Hanko meant control over the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, a key position in the defense of Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg. The leased territory also created a Soviet-controlled enclave deep in southern Finland, less than 100 kilometers from Helsinki. Between 1940 and 1941, more than 30,000 Soviet troops were stationed on the peninsula. Naval units were supported by heavy coastal artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The area was rapidly transformed into a fortified military stronghold. Forests were cut down to clear lines of fire, trenches carved through the landscape, bunkers, gun emplacements, and barbed wire reshaped the once familiar terrain. When the Continuation War broke out in June 1941, Hanko became an active front once again. The fiercest fighting occurred in the surrounding archipelago, where numerous small but deadly battles were fought over rocky islands and narrow sea passages. On the mainland, the conflict was dominated by heavy artillery duels. Yet, by the autumn of 1941, the front had shifted far from Hanko, and supplying the isolated base had become increasingly difficult. Soviet leadership decided to abandon the peninsula and redeploy troops to the Leningrad front, where manpower was urgently needed. The evacuation began in late October 1941. Ship after ship departed across the Baltic Sea. The final evacuation vessel left Hanko on December 2, 1941, bringing the Soviet lease period to an end after less than 2 years. What remained was devastation. When Finnish authorities regained control, they found a scarred and altered landscape. Nearly 1/3 of the buildings in the area had been completely destroyed, and around 60% had suffered partial damage. Destruction had been caused not only by Finnish and German bombardment, but also by Soviet demolition during both construction and withdrawal. Burned or cleared forests, collapsed houses, barbed wire, trenches, fortifications, and unexploded mines defined the peninsula, and Hanko was no longer the elegant seaside town it had once been. The city of Hanko required extensive reconstruction in the years that followed.
You know, looking this place right now, everything feels calm. It's Sunday morning, no one's around, it's just peaceful. But after the war, this whole area here was in ruins. The town hall, which is right behind me, was rebuilt in 1951. And that marked the beginning of a new chapter for Hanko.
And rebuilding began quickly, and water systems, electricity networks, roads, and public buildings were restored. At the same time, Hanko's economic foundation, its port, resumed operations, and cargo traffic steadily increased during the 1950s and 60s. Over time, the harbor developed into one of Finland's most important ports for vehicle imports and exports. Industrial diversification also marked the post-war decades, and new enterprises were established in 1950s, including textile manufacturing companies such as Hyvon Kudenneule Oy. In the following decades, additional industrial activity like engineering and metalwork provided employment alongside maritime trade. By the 60s and 70s, Hanko settled into dual identity, an industrial port town and a seasonal seaside resort. Its sandy beaches, among the longest in Finland, and preserved late 19th century villas helped revive tourism. Summer events, sailing competitions, and cultural festivals gradually restored Hanko's reputation as a leisure destination. Today, Hanko remains Finland's southernmost mainland town, with a population of roughly 8,000. The port continues to function as a major employer and Finland's primary card import harbor. Tourism also thrives on the town's beaches, maritime character, and preserved architectural heritage.